From Shadows to Silk, the untold journey of a homeless girl who melted the heart of a cold CEO and rose to become the beloved little princess of a powerful family of brothers, finding home, healing, and unbreakable bonds beyond blood in a world built on silence and steel. They say soul never sleeps, but for those like me, the forgotten, the invisible, the city becomes a cold tomb when night falls. I remember the ache of hunger more clearly than I remember the sound of my own name. The winter wind had a cruel edge that night, like a warning whispered through the alleyways. I had spent the day wandering from one overpass to another, hoping for some warmth, some leftover kindness in the form of discarded food or a neglected coin. By the time I stumbled behind the high-rising glass building near the business district, I no longer expected miracles. My thin coat clung to my body like paper. My shoes had holes in the soles. But most of all, my hope had thinned to the point of disappearance. I sat against the vent that breathed warm air and tried to sleep, even though every bone in my body trembled. Then, something changed. It wasn't the sound of footsteps that startled me, it was the stillness. A presence that didn't belong in the usual world of wandering feet and apathetic glances. Someone stood just beyond the glow of the building's lights. I had no strength to flee, but I prepared myself for the worst. Instead, warmth descended onto my shoulders. A coat thick, expensive, and smelling faintly of cedar wood and something colder. Without a word, the man turned and began walking away. That coat was the beginning. The next thing I remember clearly is sitting inside a car that purred like a heartbeat. The seats were soft and heated. I didn't speak. I didn't know what to say. I only remember the man's profile in the dim dashboard light. Stern, sharp-jawed, and utterly unreadable. He didn't glance at me even once during the drive, and yet the gesture had already spoken volumes. He wasn't afraid of me. He didn't pity me either. It was something else entirely. The mansion looked like something carved from stone and light. Black gates opened to a world I had never imagined myself entering. A world where wealth didn't sparkle. It smoldered. Guards stood like shadows, and the house staff glanced at me like I was an insect. I felt my stomach twist in humiliation, but the man simply walked ahead, not waiting, not pausing, as if expecting me to follow. That first night, I slept in a guest room with sheets that felt like clouds. I didn't sleep deeply. I was too afraid to. I thought it was all a mistake, a strange hallucination conjured by cold and hunger. But when the sun came up, the world remained, and so did he. His name was So Jae-hyun. I learned it by overhearing the staff, the head of So Industries, a name associated with steel, software, satellites, and an empire of silence. They called him the Ice King in business circles, the man whose stare could cut through boardrooms. He rarely spoke, but when he did, everyone listened. The idea that he had brought me into his house was so surreal that I dared not even try to make sense of it. He didn't offer explanations, and I didn't ask. I learned quickly how to navigate his house. I moved quietly. I kept to the corners. I ate meals in the kitchen, never daring to enter the dining room. I folded my bedsheets every morning, even though someone always came in and fixed them again. I lived like a ghost, and for a while that suited me. It was still better than the streets. But then the brothers arrived. So Jae-hyun wasn't an only child. I hadn't known that until one morning when the house, usually drowned in stillness, echoed with footsteps and voices. 3 men, each different, each dazzling in their own way. They entered color into a black and white painting. The eldest was Min-jun. His eyes were kind and observant, the type that saw everything and judged nothing. He had the quiet confidence of someone who had saved lives. The middle brother, Jin-ho, was chaos wrapped in charm. He moved with a swagger, as if the world danced to a rhythm only he could hear. He noticed me first, smirked like he already knew my story, and made the air around him lighter. The youngest, Do-yoon, barely looked my way. There was something guarded about him, something raw and unspoken. I thought they would treat me like the staff did, with suspicion and dismissal. But they didn't. They asked who I was. They waited for answers I couldn't give. Eventually, they stopped asking and simply included me. Min-jun would check on me during dinner, gently sliding extra food toward my plate. Jin-ho would make jokes at my expense, but never cruelly. And Do-yoon, though cold, began to show signs of reluctant concern. Once I found a scarf folded neatly outside my door, and I knew exactly who had left it there. Days turned into weeks, weeks stretched into months, and I began to grow roots. They made space for me without even trying. When Jae-hyun was away at meetings or locked in his office, the brothers pulled me into their orbit. Jin-ho taught me how to walk into a luxury store and not flinch at the stares. Min-jun helped me catch up on the education I had missed. Do-yoon introduced me to his favorite books. Each of them, in their own way, chipped away at the walls I had spent years building. But Jae-hyun remained distant. Not unkind, but always distant. He was the one who had brought me here, yet he treated me as if I were a responsibility, a silent burden he carried without complaint. He never raised his voice. He never showed anger, but he never smiled either. I began to think that perhaps I reminded him of something painful, something buried too deep for words. The house slowly transformed from a marble prison into something resembling a home. I found myself laughing, sometimes forgetting the girl who used to sleep under bridges. The staff stopped glaring and began nodding politely. I took classes, studied late into the night, and poured my pain into paper and ink. One afternoon, I wandered into a sunroom filled with plants and found a photo buried behind a stack of books. A girl stood beside Jaehyun, young, radiant, and smiling. There was something haunting about her, something painfully familiar. Her eyes mirrored my own. I stared at the photo for a long time, not noticing that someone had entered the room until the silence pressed too heavily. Minjun's voice had been soft that day, the kind of softness that precedes heartbreak. He told me about her younger sister Jaehyun, Ji-yoon. She died in a car accident when she was 17, a reckless driver, a missed turn. Her death shattered Jaehyun in a way no one could fix. The light went out behind his eyes, Minjun said. He buried himself in work, on duty, and in silence. I reminded him of her. Not because I looked exactly like her, but because I carried the same kind of sadness. It was then I understood. I wasn't just a charity case. It was a wound he couldn't close, a second chance the universe offered him in the form of a broken girl with nothing to lose. After that, his distance made sense. And strangely, it made me less afraid. I stopped hiding in the corners. I started living. On my 19th birthday, the brothers threw a surprise party. Nothing extravagant, just a warm gathering in the back garden. Fairy lights swayed in the breeze, cake sat half-eaten on the table, and for once I allowed myself to feel like I belonged. Jaehyun didn't attend. But the next morning, I found a small wrapped box outside my door, a necklace, simple and beautiful. No note, no name, but I knew it was from him. The years flowed like a river, and I began to move with them. I graduated from high school and enrolled in university. I worked part-time at a cafe. The brothers remained constants in my life. They weren't just figures in the background, they were anchors. Jinho became the loud protector, Minjun the quiet guardian, and Doyoon the loyal shadow who never left my side. Jaehyun stayed as he always was, distant but always watching, always aware. By the time I turned 21, I had built something of my own, a small bookstore cafe nestled in a quiet street, with shelves that smelled of cedar and stories. The brothers helped, of course, but I made the choices. I hired staff, I named the cafe, I painted the sign with my own hands, and every time I looked at it, I remembered the girl who once slept beside the train station. I filled the shop with warmth. I hired girls like me, runaways, orphans, the forgotten. I gave them hours, fair pay, and the dignity I had once been denied. We made tea, we sold books, we created a space where no one was invisible. That was when I finally understood what it meant to belong. But happiness is delicate, like a glass ornament in the wind. It never lasts forever. Just when I began to believe that I had found peace, the world reminded me that borrowed warmth never comes without a price. The first headline was quiet, tucked into the corner of a gossip column, an offhand mention of a mysterious girl seen accompanying the Seo brothers at a university event. No name, just shadows. But shadows have a way of stretching into places they don't belong. The next articles were louder. They used words like orphan, drifter, and unknown background. My past, once buried beneath layers of careful silence, was unearthed like a scandal. Photos of me circulated before and after. A girl curled beside heating vents in downtown Seoul. A young woman standing in front of a luxury car dressed in subtle elegance. The contrast fed the hunger of the media. They speculated endlessly. Was I Jaehyun's mistress? A hidden daughter? A pawn in some corporate scheme? Each headline twisted a different version of the truth, and none of them were kind. The stares returned. At the bookstore, at the cafe, on campus. Whispers clung to my clothes like ash, and with every passing day I felt myself shrinking again. I had climbed so far from the hole I had once lived in, but the world was quick to remind me that some people weren't meant to sit at the same table as princes. The brothers tried to protect me, each in their own way. Minjun reached out behind the scenes, calling in favors and asking editors to reconsider. Jinho stormed into the offices, his anger loud and reckless. Doyoon stood beside me in silence, refusing to let me walk alone. But their love, fierce as it was, could not erase the eyes that followed me wherever I went. I couldn't sleep. I barely ate. Each morning I found myself waiting for the moment Jaehyun would walk into the cafe, place a cold envelope on the counter and tell me it was over. That I had become too heavy a burden for the house he had once opened to me. But he never came. Instead, one afternoon, the world paused. The mansion gates swung open. A press conference was called. I watched it unfold on the television mounted in the bookstore corner, my heart heavy in my throat. He stood there, dressed in black, his expression unreadable. The man who rarely showed himself now faced the nation's cameras, every lens pointed at him like a blade. And then, with a chilling calm, he told the truth. He said I was family, that I was not a project, not a secret, not an affair, that I was his sister not by blood but by choice. He acknowledged my past without shame. He defended my present without apology. His words were few, but they were sharp enough to silence the city. That night I cried not because I was relieved, but because I finally believed him. I was no longer an outsider. I was his. After that, the noise died down. The media turned its eyes elsewhere, but the scars remained. Some wounds don't bleed, they just echo. I felt it every time I walked into a room, every time someone hesitated before addressing me, every time I heard someone whisper my name. But I held my head higher. The brothers continued to orbit around me, more protective than ever. Minjun's hands lingered on my shoulders a little longer. Jinho became quieter, though his jokes never truly stopped. Do-yoon walked me home every day, as if afraid I might disappear. And Jaehyun, he remained unchanged, stoic, distant, yet somehow always present. The seasons passed, and with them came a sense of stability. My bookstore flourished. I expanded the space, adding a small gallery for local artists. The girls I hired began calling the cafe their second home. We shared stories and laughter, surrounded by the scent of tea leaves and old books. I turned 23 surrounded by warmth, no longer just surviving, but truly living. Then, like all quiet miracles, it ended too suddenly. One morning, a call shattered the stillness. Jaehyun had collapsed in the boardroom. A cardiac episode. Years of stress, of bottled pain, had finally caught up with him. I rushed to the hospital, my hands trembling, my breath shallow. The sight of him pale, unconscious, tubes and machines echoing every faltering beat, broke something inside me. For all his coldness, for all the distance he built around himself, he had been the foundation of my life. The silent savior. The man who carried my darkness without asking for anything in return. For hours I sat beside him. I traced the lines of his hand with my fingers, remembering the coat he once placed on my shoulders. The silent acts. The invisible love. And then, when I least expected it, his eyes opened. In that hospital room, something unspoken passed between us. The kind of understanding that only those who've tasted loneliness can share. He didn't need to say it. I saw it in the way his eyes softened, in the way his hand weakly tightened around mine. After that day, the walls he had built slowly began to crumble. He started appearing at dinners, not often, but enough that the brothers noticed. He listened more. He spent time in the garden. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me, not with cold detachment, but with something warmer. Regret, perhaps, or pride, or both. I never asked him why he chose me. But I stopped questioning whether I deserved it. As he recovered, so did we. The family, once tethered together by quiet obligation, began to resemble something real. We no longer walked around grief. We talked about it. About the accident. About the silence that followed. Her memory didn't haunt the house anymore. It lived within it. And within me. Years later, when I fell in love, Jaehyun was the first to know. He didn't say anything, but when he handed me a small velvet box containing a family heirloom, I understood. He was giving me his blessing, not as a benefactor, but as a brother. He walked me down the aisle that spring. The ceremony was held in the garden of the mansion. White blossoms fell like snow, and fairy lights swayed in the soft breeze. The brothers stood beside me, dressed in shades of ash and pearl. I wasn't the girl they had rescued anymore. I was their sister. I was the woman they helped rebuild. Marriage didn't take me away from the family. It expanded it. My husband was gentle, kind, and grounded. He never tried to fill the spaces the brothers occupied. Instead, he honored them in the years that shaped me. Together, we continued to grow the bookstore. We opened a second branch. We partnered with shelters. We created mentorship programs for girls who needed someone to believe in them. I had become the person I once needed. And through it all, the Seo brothers remained constant. Minjun became a father. His daughter had my smile. Jinho eventually settled down, though none of us believed he ever would. Do-yoon wrote a novel of fiction, but everyone knew I was the heart of his protagonist. As for Jaehyun, he changed slowly, quietly. He never remarried. He never softened entirely. But every Sunday he arrived at the mansion at exactly 5 o'clock. He sat at the head of the table. He ate with us. He laughed, just a little. And sometimes when he thought no one was looking, he stared at me with the look of a man who had finally found peace. I often think about that night at the train station. if he hadn't walked outside, if he hadn't stopped, if he hadn't seen me. Where would I be? Somewhere cold, somewhere forgotten. But he did stop, he did see me. And because of that, I became more than a homeless girl. I became the little princess of a house full of broken princes. Not by inheritance, not by name, but by love.